The public is often sort of led to believe that science is very certain and that scientists wouldn't like uncertainty, when in fact, it's quite the opposite.
Hello and welcome, Laws of Notion podcast listeners. I'm Kristan Uhlenbrock, and I'm excited to bring you our second episode in our mini-series, where we examine critical topics at the intersection of science, policy, and human behavior as it relates to our current state of affairs. In this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Christie Aschwanden, an award-winning author and journalist, and the host and producer of Uncertain, a podcast from Scientific American. In our conversation, we explore the critical role of uncertainty in science and our everyday lives. Enjoy. So you were the host and a producer and creator for a podcast released by Scientific American called Uncertain. Would you talk to us a little bit about what that project was?
Yeah, sure. Uncertain is a 5-part podcast series about the role of uncertainty in science. And interestingly enough, it actually starts with poetry because uncertainty is really essential to all creative acts, of which science is one. It really looks at the different ways that uncertainty underlies science and the way that it drives science. I go into some ways that people, scientists doing research can be pushed astray by uncertainty or incorrect assumptions and things like that, sort of the unseen uncertainties, or as Donald Rumsfeld would have said, the unknown unknowns, right? On a broader level, the series was really tackling this idea that science is based on uncertainty, that uncertainty underlies all science, even things that we consider to be sort of settled facts, and helping the public be more comfortable with that and understand that, because the difference between science and dogma is that science is always open to new evidence. We're never absolutely certain of anything. It always has to be open to changing in light of new facts or new evidence. And this really distinguishes it from other sources of information or knowledge. Dogma is kind of how I would describe it, where you sort of have this extreme faith and just these things that are just not up for debate. And, when you are being presented with things that seem scientific or being presented as science and they're given as absolute certainties, that's kind of a red flag that maybe it isn't science.
Is there a moment with thinking about the relationship you have with uncertainty that evolved over your production of this podcast, or a conversation that you remember having with someone that really stuck with you?
Yeah, interestingly enough, talking to some of the scientists that I interviewed from the Santa Fe Institute, I did a journalism fellowship at SFI some years ago, and so I still have relationships with some people there. And so I interviewed quite a few researchers there, and it was so interesting because I talked to people at SFI from various fields. I was a little bit nervous when I started this project to go to scientists and say, "Oh, I'm doing this thing about uncertainty." And at the beginning, actually, this is going to sound kind of meta, but at the beginning and sort of the onset of this project, I wasn't absolutely certain exactly what I was going to do with this. I knew that I was very interested. I had been interested for some time in uncertainty and particularly its role in science. But I didn't have like an outline of exactly all the things I wanted to do. I came to it with a very open mind. But I also sort of didn't know in advance what these researchers were going to say. And I was a little bit afraid that I would go to them and say, "I want to talk about uncertainty in science." And they'd say, "Well, what do you want to know?" And I'd be like, "Well, what is it?" And instead, what happened was every single one, and not just at SFI, but every single person that I interviewed for this podcast, and I talked to so many different kinds of people and different researchers, said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to talk about this. This is great." We never ran out of questions. The conversation never fell flat or came to a standstill because instead of scientists saying, "Well, what do you want to know? And what does this have to do with anything?" They all sort of said, "Oh, this is one of my favorite subjects. It's what makes my job fun." One of the sort of mini epiphanies that I had while working on this was that scientists are really drawn to uncertainty. The public is often sort of led to believe that science is very certain and that science equals certainty and that scientists wouldn't like uncertainty, when in fact, it's quite the opposite. Scientists are drawn to uncertainty because those are the places where discoveries are possible. If we already know everything about something, there's nothing new to learn, right? You don't want to study something that's already been studied a million times. And so uncertainty is actually exciting. That's where the magic happens. If you are a poet and you're gonna go sit down and write a poem, well, if you knew in advance and they said, "Okay, you're gonna sit down, Kristan, and write a poem, and it's gonna be this many lines, and it's gonna say this, and it's gonna have this point," and, like, telling you in advance what it is, that's not interesting. The joy and the passion and creativity and creative process is that you don't know, and you're sort of sitting down to the unknown and finding something and creating something from that unknown. And so I think the way that I have come to look at uncertainty is that it's not scary, it's not something to be feared, but instead that it's something exciting. It's really a marker of possibility. When you don't know, anything is possible. And I think this also pertains to the future. You know, we are living in a really difficult, scary time. There's a lot of uncertainty in so many aspects of our life. And so that's really scary given sort of the direction that things are going in. At the same time, the future is not set yet. We don't know what's going to happen. We can still work to change things. We can have a vision of the future that we can work towards because it is not preordained. Think about COVID. I don't think that researchers who study infectious disease were blindsided by the fact that we had this pandemic. This is something that they had spent a lot of time thinking about and trying to prepare for. But we could not have predicted in advance exactly how this was going to go, that it would be this particular virus. Early on, there was a lot that we didn't know about the virus. And so even when we think, okay, we really have a handle on where things are going, there's always these unknown things that can come up and bubble up. So I think just being aware that there are some things that are more certain than others, right? I'm pretty sure the sun's going to come up in the east tomorrow and set in the west. Our weather forecasts are fairly good where, 24 hours in advance, I can probably decide what kind of clothing or umbrellas and things I need for the next day. But there are a lot of other things that are less certain. And I think just embracing that a little bit. And I think really sort of learning to sit with uncertainty is a really important skill. And that's something that I've really taken away from this project and from my other work on uncertainty in science is just this feeling that uncertainty is always with us. I think as humans, we have this natural tendency to be fearful of uncertainty, to want to make it go away. You really want to know for sure what's happening. Maybe you're applying for jobs. If you get this job, you're going to move to this city. If you get this other one, you'll stay where you are. You may have a really strong desire to know what's going to happen. But there's this period sometimes where there's a period of uncertainty where you're not going to know for a little while. And learning to kind of sit with that and to feel like, hey, I have these different possibilities and being able to think about them and not have that need to know for sure, I think is a real skill and something that can be really helpful. This is going to sound like a cliche, but people talk all the time about trying to live in the moment and to be present. But I think learning to be comfortable with uncertainty can be a really powerful way of helping yourself to be very present in the moment and to say, okay, I don't know what the future holds, or I don't know how this thing is going to turn out, or I don't know the answer to this pressing question. And so I'm just going to sit in this moment with what I do know and experience the here and now. And so I think seeing uncertainty as an opportunity is really key. And that's something that's been really a mind opener for me.
I love that uncertainty as this opportunity. Christy, it makes me think about you need both sides of the coin to balance because you need to understand both of those feelings, the happiness with the sadness, the fear with the excitement. And you don't know the other side of the coin if you don't have one other side of the coin. And so the idea of sitting with this and living with both the certainty and the uncertainty that exists, I think is really good advice. Another question related to this sort of human psychology bit, which is that our brains are super fallible, right? They process information, visuals, right? We look at an image and we can see different things. You can see something completely different than what I see or interpret different things. So knowing that that's a challenge in how we are receiving information, how we are perceiving the state of world and affairs, how we can think about our own weaknesses as humans and our own brains when it comes to wanting to embrace uncertainty, as you just shared.
Yeah. I think one of the things I've really learned is that I need to really focus on maintaining a sense of humility about my own beliefs and interpretations and own view of the world. I don't necessarily even mean like moral beliefs and things like that, but like, what am I seeing? Because right now we're at a moment where people's understanding of the facts are very different. And we used to have we were all operating from a set of shared facts. What we have now are these concerted misinformation and disinformation campaigns. But then you also just have different belief systems and different, ideologies where people are viewing the very same things and, they're seeing the same thing and viewing it differently or interpreting it differently. But given these sort of different ways of seeing things and different way of interpreting them, different sets of facts that people are being exposed to, 20 or 30 years ago, everyone watched the same nightly news. They got the same newspaper. They were sort of operating from the same set of what's going on, the facts and the reporting. And now there's this sense where people just trust in the media and in institutions has been really eroded. And this has been, in many cases, deliberate by political interests, with skin in the game. People are much less trusting. It's much harder to communicate sometimes with people because they just won't trust information that comes from different sources. And it can be impossible to convince them that the earth is really round, things like that. But I think that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is just that people can be looking at things from different perspectives. And I think it's very important that we're not overconfident that our way of seeing things is the right way, and that there may be things that we are overlooking or values that we're taking to this scenario that may not be shared, and that if we understand someone else's values, it doesn't mean that we have to share those, but it might give insight into why someone might see something different. And I think it's just really important to take a moment to bring some humility to the situation and think, why might someone see this differently? Like, instead of demonizing people or thinking they're dumb or they're evil, really taking a moment to say, okay, how might someone come to that belief about something? Or how might someone see this particular situation or this issue this way? So for instance, it may be, maybe we're talking about vaccines, and maybe you're talking to a parent who had something really scary happen with their kid, and they're just really trying to be loving and protective of their child. And they're getting information from not the most reliable source, but they may be coming to that with good intentions, and the way that they're interpreting things are coming from their experience. And I think honoring that and understanding that can be really important and can be a powerful way to find some ways to bridge between the two viewpoints. Doesn't mean that you have to necessarily change, but I think you have to be open to changing, because if you're not open to changing, you can't communicate.
I love this theme of communication and power communicating. Looking forward, what advice, what suggestions would you provide about how to be better about communicating about uncertainty?
Yeah, I think one of the things is to really take care not to be overconfident or to overstate the facts. I think this is something we saw during the pandemic, where there was a lot of uncertainty about a lot of things, but science was really taken as very definitive, and people were saying things like, follow the science, or the science says, but the science was evolving. There was an incredible amount of research that was being done during this time. We learned a lot in a short period of time, but our understanding of the situation was constantly in flux and was evolving as we got new evidence. I think the worst thing that you can do is present something that has a lot of uncertainty as highly certain. So uncertainty really exists on this continuum. One end of the continuum are things we can almost call like settled facts. These are things that we use like for physics. I mean, it's why you can get on an airplane and know that it will lift off and you'll get to your destination, right? It's why we can trust bridges and things like that. On the other end are things that are just like a new hypothesis that really hasn't been tested. It's an idea. It's really just a glimmer in someone's eye, and we don't really know it yet. And most research and most ideas and science really falls somewhere in between those two extremes, right? Particularly in things that are areas of active research. And so really just being very clear, where on the continuum of uncertainty is this thing? Is this something that we're really sure of? Is it something that we're less sure of? And another thing to really keep in mind is that most controversies involving science are not actually controversies about the science. They're almost always controversies about value judgments and human judgment calls about what we should do with the evidence. So, for instance, during the height of the pandemic, there were school closures. that were being done and the considerations of lockdown. And that was something that was pretty conservative. We didn't know a whole lot yet about how this was spreading. We knew that there were a lot of vulnerable populations. We know that keeping people apart can stop the spread of disease, right? But doing that has downsides as well, right? And so the science can tell you, particularly as we get more and more information about how the virus is spreading, we can do modeling and figure out, okay, if we do this lockdown or close this school, that's going to stop the spread of the virus to this extent. But we know that there are trade-offs too. And science can't tell you how to make that call and how to compare, like, okay, there's the benefit of this, of not spreading the disease, but then there's the downside of maybe the effect on the economy or kids learning. And those are judgment calls that are based on human value judgments. And the science can't tell you what to do. Science can inform the decisions, but they're almost always, by necessity, have to rely on human judgment calls as well. And usually when people are disagreeing about things, it's because of these value judgments. And I think there are a lot of examples with climate change too. It's really undeniable at this point that climate change is happening. But most of the controversy and so much of the reason why there's pushback against the science is because the implications of that are that we need to do something about it, but exactly what that should be, there's a lot of different options, right? And they all have trade-offs in one way or another. And how you weigh those and how you judge those is really a matter of perspective. The decision-making that's weighing those trade-offs, that's usually the source of the controversy.
I love this conversation. All right, I've got one more question for you, and then I'll kind of give you an opportunity to say anything you want to wrap up with. Have you seen where uncertainty has gotten weaponized and used in a negative way? And how would you address that? What should we be thinking about?
I actually wrote a whole story, a couple stories actually, when I was at 538. One of the stories, the headline was "There's no such thing as sound science," with sound science kind of in quotes. There's a very long history of this. The tobacco industry's fight against, science showing that cigarettes were harmful is, one of the most well-known examples and well-documented. But there's this idea that, well, we can't be absolutely certain. We're not sure. We need more research. And this is usually the case that, we can always have more research and that will further elucidate what we know about something. So I don't think that just that in and of itself is a marker of, oh, it's being weaponized. But you can tell that it's being weaponized when it's being used to delay decisions or when it's used to minimize risk. So, for instance, you have something like smoking where it looks like it's causing cancer, it's causing health risks, and you say, well, but we don't know with absolute certainty, or we can't be exactly sure of the exact this, that, or the other thing. And when it's like at some point you have an accumulation of evidence that's showing you something in a direction, and we're never going to have absolute certainty. And so it's important to understand that although there's not absolute certainty, taking what we know and saying we have to make decisions based on the best available evidence. There's also the idea of, are we erring on the side of caution or are we erring on the side of we just need to let everything be? And so again, this goes back to value judgments. But I think really the red flag is when you see that uncertainty is being enlarged, it's being emphasized. This was something, for instance, with some of the COVID vaccines, they said, oh, well, this is really new. We can't be sure. And it's true, it was new, but there was also a whole lot of evidence and there were some very large clinical trials. So at some point, you have enough evidence to say, we can make a decision here and we can make a judgment. Another way of looking at it is, okay, who is telling you that this is too uncertain to make a decision or to know something? And what skin do they have in the game? Do they have a point of view? That doesn't mean that all the time that can't be legitimate, but oftentimes it's very clear when there's sort of a push. There's an industry that is trying to protect themselves, so they're minimizing a risk and saying, oh, there's too much uncertainty.
Great, thank you. I'll give you some moments to have a closing remark or thought on this topic.
I think one of the things about uncertainty, I think it's just really important to learn to sit with it and to be comfortable having it in your life and recognizing that it's going to be there. Another thing that I think is really, really good is just maintaining curiosity and an open mind. And then when you're going about the world or being presented with science, really stop and think, how might I be wrong about this? Maintaining a sense of intellectual humility and this understanding that I could be wrong and I want to be open to new ideas and to new evidence. It doesn't mean that you can't be confident about things, but being open and not being rigid in your thinking and in your beliefs.
Thank you. And if people want to follow some of your work and see what's next, where would you direct people and anything you're excited about that you're working on?
You can find the Uncertain podcast at scientificamerican.com/uncertain. You can also find links to my work and some more information at my website, which is just my name, christieaschwanden.com.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about the Institute and this series, visit us at institute.dmns.org and be sure to sign up for our mailing list. Thanks and see you soon.